occasionally things just disappear and there's no explanation.
All right, I might formally kick off the tasting. So my name is Oliver Maruda. I'm one of the founders of the Whiskey List. You've heard my spiel, most of you are many times before, but the very quick housekeeping tonight is we've got plenty of cask strength drams. So yeah, please pour all six out if you have six glasses in front of you. Those last two whiskies, the 46-year-old blend and the Auchentoshan 31-year-old do sing after letting them breathe for 10-20 minutes. So if you can get some extra glasses and pour your six whiskies out. For those watching the tasting a little bit on, so the tasting order tonight will be the Westie Sponge, the 2018 Raasay 5-year-old. I'll get my correction pronunciation soon. The Ben Nevis #2, Old Orkney 19-year-old. We switched the Milton Duff for the Inchgower. Whiskey 5 will be the 46-year-old blend, and the last whiskey will be the 31-year-old Auchentoshan. So don't drink and drive. Lots of cask strength whiskies here. If you've got any questions, just throw it into the chat and I'll ask Angus on your behalf. Pretty easygoing, small casual chat. We've had to do a bit later start today, just because of the time difference of Scotland, and Angus has kids to deal with as well as many of us. So with that fact, let's get started. Angus, welcome to, I think, what, your fifth tasting with us now?
I've not been keeping a running total, but something like that, yeah. No, it's always a pleasure to do this, and it's always heartening to see people in such, literally as far away as possible to get enjoying products that we've put a lot of work and time and effort into making happen. So that's yeah, that's what whiskey culture is all about. So thanks very much for having me back, and thank you for putting together a really nice little lineup of some of our most recent bottlings. Um, yeah, so in case anyone doesn't know, yeah, I'm Angus MacRaild and I'm the director of Decadent Drinks. And it's also my job to be the company's head of product. So I'm in charge of sourcing and supply and also the selection and just generally shepherding into existence of all our products. So um, that's, blending, cask selection, working with suppliers, creating potions and recipes and designing the labels. So and working with artists to then make those designs happen. So that's my role at Decadent Drinks. Um, so we'll kick off with the first dram, and this is a new-ish, pretty new series that we launched, which is like a little side series. Um, you can probably tell I quite like the idea of whiskey as place, as being something that exudes a sense of place, not terroir, as a separate thing, but I like that malt whiskey from Scotland tends to, when it's at its best, I think, give a sort of an evocative sense of where it's from. I find this with Islay whiskey, with Orkney whiskey, and also whiskies of the Western Highlands. And the western coast of Scotland is where I'm from. My family's originally from Skye, also around Fort William, Loch Fyne, all these sorts of places is my old stomping grounds and where we visited growing up. And so it's a place that holds us, quite a special place in my heart. And I wanted to do a series that celebrated the quite specific and individual and charismatic whiskies that come from this part of Scotland. So that's where the concept for Whisky Sponge came from. And you can see where this is going. We've had Orkney Sponge, we do Old Orkney now, we've done Islay Sponge, and now Westie Sponge. So this sort of philosophy is very much playing out in practice in terms of the sort of bottlings we're doing. So this is the second bottling of Westie Sponge. We did a Knockneen first, and this is a Isle of Raasay whiskey. It's a 5-year-old single malt, and it's a combination of a refill hogshead and a first fill barrel, both from 2018. And we worked with the distillery to select these casks, and then they dumped these casks together around about middle of last year, and then put them back into the same two casks to continue maturing. So it created a small batch, and then that small batch whiskey is now going off in two different casks in two different directions. What we've bottled is the barrel, the first fill barrel. The same whiskey is still sat in the refill hogshead, and that'll continue to mature for a few years. And hopefully it's something that Decadent Drinks will bottle in the future. I wanted to do Raasay because, first of all, it's it's Isle of Skye. Isle of Raasay is a very small island off, um, or within the waters of the island of Skye, and it's sort of archipelago of small islands, and it's a beautiful, stunning part of the world. Talisker was always one of my favorite whiskies, and again, very much in that category of West Coast whiskies, which make you think of the place they're from and have this kind of evocative power. And I think Raasay, having visited a few times now and started to taste a number of the casks in the warehouse, I thought there's some distillate coming through here, which is really interesting and very powerful and really with a lot of charisma, which is not necessarily something reflected in the distillery bottlings. A lot for their own bottlings, they've tended to use casks with a lot more wood activity. And so I really wanted to do something which went a completely opposite direction and expressed a really vivid, um, like clear picture on their distillate. And so that's what this bottling was designed to do. So it was the barrel from that mix I said, and it was bottled at 57.1. So that was reduced by about 5 degrees to that strength. And again, this is something that we do very commonly at Decadent Drinks. We use things like mixing two different casks or different ages together and adding a little bit of water to do targeted reduction. And that just helps to just create a singular profile of whiskey and to create a product which shows how we think, it shows at its best in bottle, and a product that wouldn't otherwise exist if we hadn't taken those very deliberate decisions. And to me, that's my philosophy of independent bottling. I like to play a bit more of an active role in creating products and try to be creative and in ways that create something which are, maybe greater than the sum of its parts, or a product that, as I say, wouldn't otherwise exist. So this is a young whiskey, obviously, and I think quite a powerful whiskey. There's a little bit of peat in there. The hogshead that matured, the refill hogshead that matured to half of this had previously held some peated malt whiskey. Don't know what it was, but that's where this little trace note of peat comes from. It's not from the barley on this occasion, it's from the previous filled cask. So that little bit of peat is just helping to accentuate these very, very quite coastal, salty, fresh tones. It's very mineral. It's quite a powerful whiskey. It's very, very typical of what I would call island and Highland style traditional profile malt whiskey. So I'm quite happy with how this has turned out. I think it's a whiskey which is very powerful, probably demands attention. It's probably got room for a little bit more reduction. And it's probably the sort of whiskey that you could spend a lot of time dissecting it, like we're doing in this tasting with nosing glasses, but probably would work quite well in a hip flask, or if you're actually on Raasay to have a little beach bonfire and sit on the shore and get eaten by midges and drink this from a big tumbler while grilling langoustine or something like that. That would be a perfect environment in which to enjoy this whiskey, I think. So yeah, it ticks the boxes of what I was trying to achieve, and I'm pretty happy with it. So I'm interested to hear everyone's feedback on it, because as far as I'm aware, this is the first um, bottling of Raasay at all that really exposes the underlying distillate without a huge amount of intense wood activity.
Just reading some of the comments. So Leo shared mintiness on the nose, floral notes, spearmint, chewing gum, oaky, palate with some peaty finish. Michael, fresh oak on the nose, agree with a whiff of mintiness. For me, it's quite malty. The barley's shining. Is it island malt?
No, I don't think so. I think this would be probably malt grown. I think most of their malt is grown on mainland Scotland. Sort of probably around Perthshire, Central Highlands, that sort of place. It's definitely a whiskey that has a lot of the raw ingredients of malt whiskey on display. It's a whiskey that I think is quite evocative of, like the sweetness of fresh wort and, like you say, raw barley, that kind of quite cereal, like malt extract. Sometimes I get these kind of like beery notes off it. So this kind of whiskey that makes you think about things about fermentation and mashing and the very like raw physical production side of whiskey. Like if you've ever stuck your head in a mash tun that's just been emptied and you get that hit of warm, sweet draff after a mash, I think that's a very common characteristic that these sorts of whiskies remind me of, which is the sort of bare bones and bare ingredients of whiskey making.
But for
So
those, I was just gonna say, for those who got their cameras on, thumbs up or down, how you feel about this one, and maybe those who don't, just in the comments, yay or nay, just to get a sense check. For me, it reminds me of quite a lot of Aussie whiskies, that rawness. But they're trying to achieve this, and sometimes they put it into very wet casks, and the spirit is hidden. And for me, yeah, some of the bourbon casks we've had locally here does have that fresh grain element. So yeah, maybe it's a sign of I'm not sure what I'm trying to say. A lot of Aussies, I think, are trying to emulate this, but aren't getting there, if that makes sense.
this one, so when we had the bourbon barrel on its own, it was creamier and there was more vanilla and more obvious wood character coming through, which is why I blended it with the refill hogshead, because the refill hogshead was even more naked than this. And as much as I wanted something where the distillate shone, you obviously need to balance that by having some level of roundness and maturity from the wood. And so it was deliberately trying to balance those two profiles and create something that had a bit more of a harmonious sort of position between the two influences. So yeah, it is true. Even in Scotland, if you just put stuff in active wood, it can very quickly get buried. I imagine in Australia that you've got a hotter climate often to contend with, which is obviously going to cook out a lot more stuff from the wood very quickly. And that's probably something which is quite hard to control if you're trying to go towards a profile a bit more like this. This is the thing about Scottish malt whiskies, which is quite special, and Ireland to an extent as well, is that the climate helps deliver this sort of profile, which is more balanced. And people forget nowadays everyone focuses so much on wood and uses wood very deliberately, and it's really become a flavoring agent. But traditionally, Scottish malt whiskey was, you know, wood was always seen as important and integral. Of course it was, but when you look at whiskey historically, many of them were much more balanced between distillate and wood influence. That's what I would term a kind of older style approach to whiskey. Um,
Leo actually just raised that same point. Would this be something you might have gotten from an illicit distiller back in the past, a little less refined, etc.?
Absolutely. I mean, I tried some very old whiskey from Blair Castle Estate, which, who knows whether it was exactly what um it was, people thought it was, but it was certainly from the bottles and from the taste and the all the analysis done, it was very, very old. And it was probably whiskey made in some kind of illicit distillation rig. And it wasn't a million miles away from this in terms of, very fat, very oily, very raw, not much wood influence, but still very good. I think whiskeys like this remind us that whiskey is about making distillate. Like you can fill boring distillate that is very neutral and very simple and has a lot of interesting stuff stripped out of it, or distillate that's flawed. No cask in the world, whether active or inactive, is going to tart up that kind of distillate and make it pretty. You need fundamentally to have great distillate. And in my mind, great distillate is something that is not totally pure, but has the right kind of characterful chemical makeup, which, when put into casks and really good distillate, will sing in active wood or in inactive wood, in my view. Really great distillate is all about precursors which are just ready to be brought out of themselves by maturation in cask. Um, and this bottling to me reminds me of old 5-year-old Glen Grant. So there used to be many bottlings of Glen Grant done at higher strength, 100 proof, 104 proof, which are equivalent to, 57, 59% alcohol, same strength as this. These are really inspirational bottlings to me, and often companies like Gordon and MacPhail, Campbell Hope and King, um, Robert Watson, old, Scottish merchant bottlers from the 60s and 50s and earlier decades they did a lot of bottlings like this, and they're quite hard to find now. They're quite rare, but I've opened many over the years, and those are the bottlings which were great examples of this style. Pure raw distillate from refill wood, but they were still brilliant, brilliant whiskies because the underlying distillate was incredible. In some ways, this reminds me also of other types of spirit drink like mezcal or tequila. You know, it's the blanco ones which enthusiasts consider to be the best because you're close to the beautifully sculpted raw distillates. Particularly with mezcal, I think this bottling actually reminds me in many ways of a really good sort of complex, punchy mezcal in some respects. Um,
I think we just conscious
Vegemite.
of
Oh,
time.
nice.
So
Sorry, yeah.
yeah, let's jump on the Nevis. I'll quickly read out some of the previous comments. So John said, simple, quite a lot of minerally oak, raw malt, smell on the mash, reminiscent of oat. Yeah, I can totally understand. Michael says there's a creaminess, still thickness, which coats the palate. I think that's ABV. It's you can see it on the glass as well. It's very viscous, oily. Now we're getting some triple oaked. Something seems to cover up the mistake. Simple but good. All right. I think people may be jumping in
I
straight into the
definitely agree with
Nevis.
Vegemite. I definitely agree with Vegemite. That's basically like yeasty umami richness, and that's that Vegemite Marmite vibe is something that I think is very typical for these sorts of whiskies. But yes, Ben Nevis. So dram number two. This is a very recent bottling of ours, Whisky Sponge Edition 85. So this was a Ben Nevis which started life and again, a lot of the comments are made about distillate and characterful whiskey, I think, and also West Coast whiskies you can apply to Ben Nevis as well. It's a lovely, very, very charismatic, very big, boisterous, no nonsense, quite challenging whiskey in many respects. You know, I think whiskies like Ben Nevis are perhaps more challenging than some heavily peated whiskies because with peat, you just need to kind of like the flavor of peat. Ben Nevis is a complicated, greasy, oily, waxy, fatty, challenging malt whiskey. I love it. And this bottling is a good example of that sort of style. So this started life as a 2013 refill butt. So a pretty plain oak butt of Ben Nevis, which was a lot of bottles. It was very full and very strong. It had been filled at much higher strength. So it was around about 66% cask strength. So what I decided to do was to try and manage the volume of this and also I wanted to try to just tidy up the whiskey a little bit, give it a little bit more richness, and manage the ABV reduction down in stages. But I wanted to do that without bombarding it with too much oak. So what we did, which is a bit of an experiment, and instead of re-racking, I've decided to call this de-racking because we're not re-racking into active oak, we're re-racking into slightly less active, like more neutral oak. So we took 4 refill quarter casks and we split the whiskey evenly between them. And then we managed the reduction in the cask in stages down to about 60%. And we took 2 of these quarter casks and after about 5 months in the quarter casks, we reduced it down to about 60. So we then dumped these 2 together and made the final reduction to 52%, which is the bottling strength for this one. I was playing around with strength quite a lot. I originally was going to do 57.1, just do 100 proof, but the more I played with water, the more I thought actually it becomes even more kind of greasy and mechanical and fatty and waxy if you go a bit lower. It seems to bring out more of these heavy um, chemical molecule elements and break them up and just bring out more of that distillate charisma. So that's why we went with 52% as the bottling strength. And again, this is a good example of, these are the sort of decisions we try to make as a bottler that are entirely, quality based, like what will deliver the best possible product at the end of the day. So to me, this is a good example. We did a 10-year-old Ben Nevis at the start of last year for our Equinox and Solstice Spring Edition. And that was much more on the kind of sweet, waxy side. This one is much more on the mechanical, heavy, greasy side. And yeah, if you like that style, this will definitely do it for you. So yeah, I'm pretty pleased with the result, and I hope you'll enjoy it. I'm keen to hear what you think.
With that first Nevis, the Equinox one, we had some comparisons to like your coastals, like your old Pulteney's, your Clone Leashes. The
Yeah,
zestiness, the citrus was there as well, but this is a big Nevis. It's yeah,
I
more
think
diesel
there's a
than
lot of
sweet.
yeah, I think there's a lot of synergy between most of those sort of more individualistic Highland malts, that just basically run around the outside of the top of Scotland from uh essentially from like Inverness all the way back round down to, Oban. They're so much more charismatic than most of the kind of central Speyside ones, really. Um, and I definitely think the coastal distilleries, I mean, you can make arguments about how much that's just your brain doing that, but there frequently does seem to be characteristics which allude to, going back to what I said earlier, that make you think of the kind of the place. I mean, Klein Leash is another, absolutely typical example of that. Yeah, so I'm pretty pleased with this Nevis, and I think it's on balance probably towards the sort of heavier, fuller bodied end of that whiskey spectrum.
So a few comments echoing those sentiments. So oiliness and funk is there on the nose. Justin says this Ben Nevis is awesome. John, florals, honey vanillas, massive coated mouthfeel, back end burnt oaks, really nice. Leo again, Nevis character is there, but some of the heavy elements highlighted. Still learning to judge whiskey more refined. Beer judging is much easier. It's practice. We'll get there. Creamy, flavorful honey. That honey note is on your second and third sip. It's really just it's layered in there. I'm really enjoying it.
It's a nice it's a nice development with this whiskey, I think. There's quite a lot going on. So I agree. I think once your palate acclimatizes a bit, you start to discover some of the more subtle aspects which are sort of buried beneath all that weight of like sheep wool oil and toolboxes and bike chain grease and all these sort of mad flavors that Ben Nevis seems to exude. Um, being a former beekeeper, I can pick up the huskies and flood. That's that's some pretty good life experience there.
Yeah, you're well suited for
So,
drinking whiskey.
and on the topic of honey, that's probably a good point to jump onto the next whiskey. So, dram number three is our second bottling in our sort of ongoing emerging series of the old Orkney brand, which is a brand we bought from Gordon MacPhail, and that I wanted personally for a long time to see if I could do something with this brand because I absolutely love it. It's a historical brand, and really traditionally it started life as the bottled brand of Stromness Distillery on Orkney. Stromness closed in around 1928, and it's a big shame because it's such an incredible whiskey, and its marketing and its presentation of itself as a brand was so ahead of its time and so much about humor and fun and cheekiness and playfulness. And in that way, it was really, and also like nature and romance and celebration of Orkney in a way that I think was so much smarter and more uh, authentic than something like what Highland Park does today with just, hammering that Viking bullshit, for the nth time. So in that respect, I thought it was really ahead of its time. And it was a big inspiration for what we do with Decadent Drinks, having that element of tongue in cheek, that element of humor, and being playful and making sure that there's color and there's fun and there's originality in what you're doing and how you're presenting your products. And what underpinned all that was an absolutely incredible whiskey. I've been lucky enough to try Stromness on three occasions, once or twice from bottles and once from a cask sample. And it's a like monster. It was a monstrously peated whiskey. It was incredibly powerful, incredibly charismatic, and you can look online and see the old stills they used to use. They use these tiny little SMA stills. They were famous for their, if you can, the whiskey world version of famous in the late 19th century. They were really dinky little things, and they made obviously a very heavy, crazy whiskey, and it was partially in a cave in the cliff attached to the town of Stromness, the port town of Stromness in Orkney. So there's so much romance about it. And so I thought this was so cool. And I knew Gordon MacPhail had the brand. I knew they'd used it in the 90s for a blended whiskey and never done anything with it since. So I was really surprised they agreed to sell it to me. So that was great. So we've just started to do something with it where we're just using these Orkney malts, which are Highland Parks. So this one here is a 19-year-old Highland Park. It's 2004 refill hogshead, and we bottled it at 53%. So reduced down from about 63. So there's about 10 degrees of reduction in this. And the yeah, what we're trying to do with the brand is just go a bit slow, a bit steady. We did a little bit of playing around with it with Sponge first, where we did a bit of an Old Orkney Whisky Sponge mashup, where we did 3 bottlings of Orkney Sponge, where we used some of the Old Orkney iconography. And I was really just kind of thinking through those bottlings, what am I going to do with this? But now got to the point where I'm pretty clear what we want to do. We're just going to do ongoing occasional bottlings of this Old Orkney brand. There'll be small batch or there'll be single cask. If we can find some Scapa, that would be great, but I don't think we'll be able to get any Scapa, so they'll almost certainly all be Highland Park. And yeah, it's just an excuse to do beautiful artworks that celebrate the real idiosyncrasy that is Orkney malt whiskey, and do that in a way which is very different to what Highland Park do, and very in line with what we like to do at Decadent Drinks, which is fun, humorous, evocative, surreal, silly, original artworks. So yeah, and this whiskey in particular, this 19-year-old, is in line with that and a bit different to our first bottling under the Old Orkney series, which was a 13-year-old, and that was from a first fill barrel. That was peatier, I would say, peatier and a bit overall a bit sort of brighter and sweeter. This is something which is very full-bodied and quite oily and waxy, but obviously the 19 years gives a greater level of maturity. And so I think you get the peat in there, but it's a little bit deeper, a little bit more buried. And there's a lot more lovely waxiness and honey. And there's also something in this which actually makes me think a little bit of the Ben Nevis, in that there's a little bit of a mechanical aspect to this as well, a little bit of a sort of greasy, fatty character. Um, I think it goes to show that Highland Park as a distillate is still incredible, and that the best place to drink Highland Park is independent bottlers, not official bottlings. Um,
On
so
that
yeah, I'm
note,
pretty happy with bottling.
mate, this, yeah, round of applause on this whiskey. I, for a long time, was in love with Highland Park, the 18. Then they changed the recipe and in the OB bottlings, and I couldn't find what I was looking for. And this was before I really got into IBs. And then, yeah, you can pick up most bourbon casks, IB, Highland Park, or Secret Orkneys, where most of them are bottled, and generally they are awesome. But yeah, what you've done with this label, how you've brought it back to life and picking casks. Something I like to do personally on these really hot, humid Sydney nights is get a giant ice cube, pour Orkney or Highland Park IB into it, a bourbon cask, and as the ice melts, the oiliness, the viscosity,
Mm,
you don't
nice.
swirl your glass. You just let it kind of just like mold in around itself, and it's wonderful. But that's a guilty pleasure for me.
No, that sounds great. I definitely, whenever I eventually make it to Oz, I'll definitely join you in one of those. Um, yeah, I'm glad people seem to like this one. It's been a successful bottling for us because I would say it's probably one of my favorite labels that we've ever done. And I feel that we've managed to reintroduce this brand in a way which is just a little bit low key, but is sensitive and is not just directly ripping off and sitting on the laurels of the original, but is managing to put our own spin on it in a way which is celebratory of the original brand, but also taking it forward and doing something new with it as well. So I'm really happy with it. We got accused once by Nick Morgan, it was on Instagram, said it was historical appropriation, which I thought was complete bullshit. But by and large, everyone's response to it seems to have been positive, and I think also it helps that the whiskies we managed to select have been different from each other, but all very evocative, really hammer home that Orkney character, that Highland Park character, and have both been really good. So Yeah, I've got a couple of nice things in the works in the warehouse for future Old Orkney bottlings. I don't want to rush and do loads of them. We'll just do them as and when the whiskies are ready. So the next one, hopefully, later this year, will be a really nice multi-vintage Orkney malt. So yeah, looking forward to that.
Sign us up. The moment you said the label, I noticed I grabbed my bottle. Michael and John grabbed their bottles as well. So you've got some fans in the room already with this particular label is so good.
So when we do these labels, so we have two main artists that we use, and they're both very different, which is great because it gives us quite a broad range of approaches to our labels. So one of them is called Rob, and he's a professional graphic artist in Edinburgh, and he can do pretty much anything. But the other one is Kat, and um, she's much more of a hobby artist, and she just does everything by hand. So I work with Kat for the Old Orkney series, and she does the entire label as a single piece of artwork, including all the text. Normally, when you make labels, you might have an artistic component that then gets transferred to your designer, and they'll drop the artwork and into a file and put text on top of it and build the label digitally. Whereas with Cat and increasingly with what we're doing, so the Ben Nevis actually was also Cat as well, and that's another one where she just draws the entire label by hand, including the ABV, the outturn, everything that would ordinarily get done digitally. So each label becomes a single complete piece of artwork, which I really love that approach. And that to me is very much more like original Old Orkney labels and designs. These are things that were always done by entirely by hand. And so it's taking that approach and using it again, but obviously with a little bit more of a modern spin on it. And so I think that's worked really well. And that's my plan for Old Orkney, is to always make sure that each label is a individual single piece of art. So yeah, I'm looking forward to coming up with more designs for the series. Got lots of ideas, just can't rush them out, so I have to be patient.
Plenty of time
Uh,
to get there. Shall
so that's
we
good.
jump onto our mystery
Yeah,
whiskey?
yeah. So Inchgower. So this is just one of our bottlings where we occasionally will just pick a cask, and it'll be single cask strength, and very traditionalist. And that's what this was. This was a cask of Inchgower. We bought this, I think, with a couple of other bits and pieces of a little small parcel of casks. And I've been looking to find a nice Inchgower for a while, because Inchgower to me is one of Diageo's more interesting distillates, in that I think it's still got a kind of, it's a bit like Diet Kleinlich. Dalyuen has the same sort of vibe, in that it's like it's got something quite waxy about it and something quite full-bodied, and it's clearly a blender's malt. It's a sort of whiskey that blenders love because it's a very good ingredient to building backbone in blends and putting body in. And that's why things like Kleinlich and Dalyuen are popular with blenders as well, because they have a little bit of robustness to them. But it's not a malt which is super popular with drinkers, which I think is a shame, because there's many, many good ones out there. And this to me demonstrated everything that I feel about Inchgower and everything that I like and enjoy about it as a malt. So perfect age, 21 years old, really nice maturity, nice naturally, not low, but nice, perfect natural drinking strength. So 48.9% alcohol. That's almost at 48.5, which is my kind of preferred drinking strength. We do Equinox and Solstice at 48.5, which to me is like the right sweet spot between 46 and higher cask strengths. You retain a little bit more power. And so this had sort of arrived at that point quite naturally. And refill hogshead, perfect cask type. So, you know, a light touch cask, which gives, even after 21 years, plenty room for the spirit character to still be present, to breathe, to, have lots of room to show in a really positive way. So I didn't feel we needed to do anything with this. It ticked all my boxes and I was very happy with it. I haven't tasted it for a long time, but my recollection was that it was just that really nice combination of that slightly lighter, slightly softer, waxy profile of Inchgower with some really nice little sweeter fruit, sweeter honey notes, and even a little bit of things like more pronounced citrus and green fruit coming through as well that just brought a little bit of vivacity and brightness to the final whiskey. So, you know, every so often we just do single casks where we just do nothing to them because the whiskey is perfectly fine, and anything we do to change it will be to its detriment, not to its benefit. So this was exactly that circumstance. I remember being very happy with this, but it's a bottling that kind of went totally under the radar for us. It sold out in a couple of months and then it was gone. And I think this is the first time anyone has done it in a tasting. So yeah,
It's
know what you all think.
before I read the comments, I know very little about it. I know it's Speyside and I know it's Diageo, and that's basically it. So you probably get it in Johnny Walker or something, and we just do not see IBs bottle this distillery here at all. I can't remember the last time I've ever seen it. So I think it's struggled to sell because I don't think anyone's looking for it. Anyone knows, like you read about a distillery, you know, like we were chatting before the call, the marketing malts, you hint at where that's from and it will go in seconds, but this is just no one knows about this distillery. So yeah, it's just been sitting. We had one bottle I think spare, just collecting a little bit of dust, but I'm glad we opened up and got to try it.
Yeah, no, it's so true. I mean, it is still one of those distilleries where it's kind of not under the radar. It's just in this group of distilleries that no one cares about. That's never really excited people. And I think that's a shame because there are some distilleries that you can say that about where it's justified, like Altavania or I was going to say Auchentoshan, but then realized we've got a really beautiful Auchentoshan from me in this lineup. So, um, but yeah, for whatever reason, people have never cottoned onto it in the kind of realms of whiskey culture and geekery, which is a shame because even now, like we tasted recently some samples of just young, bourbon barrel, first fill hogshead Inchgower, like 9, 10, 12-year-old stuff, and they're really nice whiskies. It's true that they are, they're blenders whiskies in the sense that they've got good backbone, good structure, good charisma, but the casks are very similar, and they're not necessarily things that, as a bottler, you choose to bottle, um, because there's so many whiskies like that out there. But they are very good quality and much better than and much more consistent than a lot of often bigger names that you can find or try to look for as a bottle. Anyway, I like this, and yeah, nice that you guys are getting to try it. Uh,
A great whiskey. I
Pink
was
blush in color. Not sure about that.
maybe your glassmate. Yeah, Michael and Leo hit it on the head. If you gave me this blind, the grassy note on the nose reminded me of Tullibardine, but the sweetness and those light fruits completely threw me. So again, it is such a unique whiskey.
Yeah, I need to open one. I've got one in our warehouse tasting stock, so I will probably try and look to do something with it pretty soon. I'd like to try it again. Cool.
Yeah,
So shall we uh, move
the
along to the next
blend.
round? Yeah.
Yes. Yep.
So this is a recent bottling for us as well, and it's one where it just was happy accident really that we managed to get this. So well, really my business partner was dealing with a private cask owner who had a number of some really nice casks actually, and it was the casks we were after. So it was some late 80s, early 90s Aberlour, early 90s Glen Murray. Um, there was a nice Milton Duff in it. So we were after this parcel of casks. Thought these are great. This is exactly the sort of shit we need for our bottlings. But they also owned a bottled cask of this whiskey, this blended Scotch. And when I looked at it on paper, I thought this could be really interesting. And they hadn't done anything with it. They just bottled it. It was a 1969 single cask of blended Scotch, 46 years old, been bottled in 2015. And it had just been bottled into standard, tall round bottles. So exactly the kind of glass that we use, the same capsules, and it just had a basic kind of like holding label put on it, and it was sitting on a pallet in a warehouse. And so we got a bottle to open and try, and you know, I was really pleased with it. Obviously, this is delicious 46-year-old blended Scotch, and thought, let's do something fun as a sponge bottling with this. It seems daft not to do it. Um, in terms of the whiskey itself, sadly, I just don't know what's in it. The people that owned it didn't know what was in it. I believe that this is a cask they would have bought while it was maturing, so not at the time. It would probably make sense that if they were buying these casks in the early 90s, they may well have bought this cask around the same time. And just because it was getting quite old and the strength was naturally around 46, I suspect that's the reason they would have chosen to bottle it. But they just then didn't do anything with the bottles. So that's how we ended up with this bottling. There's been quite a few people online saying, ha ha ha, famous malt snob, self-declared malt snob, Angus MacRaild bottles blend. What's this about? So that's true. I do generally prefer malts to blends, but doesn't mean that I don't love good blends when they come along. And this is one such instance where I think there's definitely like this is a really good blend. It's got probably a little bit more grain whiskey than malt whiskey inside, which I think shows on the nose immediately, where you get this big hit of rich, sweet coconut, and
Mhm.
this lovely like piney wood spice. And but as you go along and as you sip, I think the malt characteristics start to come back towards the finish, and it starts to get a little bit more oily, and these little waxy components come out. I think it's a really lovely, complex, mature blended Scotch, and I think it's rare to try these sorts of whiskies, particularly a mix of malt and grain. Like you can more easily find very old grain whiskies from this kind of at this kind of age, 40 to 50 years old, than you can find blended Scotches at 40 to 50 years old. So yeah, I'm really happy with it. I think as a chance to try a very old, long aged in cask blended Scotch, it's a cool opportunity. To me, the age and the natural cask strength are kind of perfect. It's just been bottled at a real sweet spot. You don't feel the wood. It does obviously have a lot of wood influence, but it's not too excessive. To me, it's what old whiskey should be about, is these kind of flavor profiles, these kind of characteristics. And for people that enjoy blended Scotch, like really good blended Scotch, to me, this is a really good blended Scotch. And there's a lot of pleasure in this whiskey. This is a whiskey which absolutely is about. I wouldn't use a nosing glass for this if I had a bottle at home open, which I do. So uh, to me, this is tumbler, big dram, feet up, film on sort of whiskey. It's, simple, pleasurable, uh, not too much brain power sort of whiskey. That's the sort of thing that I really love to do with decadent drinks, because that's what decadence is. It's about decadence. Um, so yeah, I drink all night dram. Exactly, exactly. Summed it up in one sentence. So yeah, I'm curious to see what you all think of it. I wish I knew what the blend was. Um, because it's a vintage 1969, I expect it was new makes blended at birth and then put into cask. But unfortunately, we just don't know what grains and malts are in it. I would love to know, but yeah, alas, don't know.
A really good customer of ours. If there's bottles left over, sometimes Chris or I, if we really love it, we'll put a bottle aside for ourselves. But this again was so popular, we kept none for ourselves, which is fine. Good customer invited us around on Saturday. He said, let's crack open some bottles. I said, hey, I recognize that label. And he opened it on the spot for us.
Cool.
And to actually spend 2-3 hours just with a big glass, and he's very generous with his pours, too generous sometimes. Yeah, there was a bit like early Octomores and other cool things around us, some 7.1s and stuff, but we just sat on this all night, and it is it just
Yeah.
changes layers and layers. 46 years, you got to let it at least an evening to tell you its story.
Yeah, I think that that's very true, that sometimes in whiskey, the thing that gets a bit lost or overlooked, because we spend a lot of time analyzing high strength, cast strength, powerful drams, uh, we forget that sometimes just pleasure and easiness and something which is just, you know, really approachable and is like just a big hug in a glass is kind of kind of what it's about. That's often where it starts for people, and it's often where it ends as well. Those are the sorts of whiskies which I go to more now as a drinker, just for something pleasurable at night, than I do the kind of big, more boisterous, powerful stuff. There's a place for that, absolutely, but yeah, what you're describing, just sitting for several hours, spending time with a whiskey like this and a big measure, that for me is kind of like what sits at the heart of our culture. Um, yeah, no, I agree. That's great. Sounds good. I'm glad that it's getting generally positive feedback from people. Um, I was a bit nervous when we did it because I just thought this is a bit of a departure for us, but you know, I'm pleased that it's worked out well and that it seems to be anyone that tries it seems to say, it's a lovely dram. So yeah, that's good. Lots of positive
The
comments in the chat. So yeah, it's nice to see as well.
Yeah, I'm not going to read them all out. For me, like we priced it as fairly as we could. It's quite expensive for a blend, but when you compare it to the crazy prices for a 50-year-old Glendronach, the Macallans, all this sort of stuff, like this is just pure value for money for the exact same age statement. Like you just cannot compete. And that's the power of independent bottlers. They bring something new to the table, not just on flavors, but also price. And then I will continue to echo this to the end of days. This is why we love independent bottlers so much. They make whiskey accessible. Yes, it's expensive dram, but it's way more accessible than some of the other OB bottlings of similar age out there.
Yeah, and I mean, on the price front, we tried to put it out at that was about as cheap as we could do it. Not cheap. I mean, it is an expensive bottle, but it was the about as low as we could go price wise based on what we paid for it. Um, on balance, I do think for a 1969 46-year-old single cask strength whiskey, even if it is a blend, um, in today's market, like you say, compared to some other things out there, uh, it's pretty good. And I think also having tasted a lot of these very old um, even single malts. Uh, there's many which are way more expensive than this and not as good in my experience. Um, Also, if you like this, because it is quite a sort of grain-led profile, I would strongly recommend our latest notable age statement bottling, which is a 1972 50-year-old blended grain, and that is really superb. I liked the cast sample, but when I tried the bottle just the other day, it just been released, really, really good. And again, I'm not normally a grain person. We we deliberately well, we had opportunities to bottle grain whiskies before, and I've just never found one that I was like really happy with that I liked. To me, they need age to sort of show well, but this one is just really superb. So I think if you like this whiskey, you would really like this 50-year-old grain. So, that's one to maybe think about for a future tasting if you guys are bringing any in.
We are, I believe, if it hasn't landed, it will in the next shipment. So Chris will send out the emails to everyone, so you no doubt get notified.
It's got a
I
similar profile
see
to it, more
our,
power.
our, our wonderful host has finally arrived as we're about to finish up the tasting. Hi, Emma. She was doing another tasting in Melbourne tonight. So
Hi, Emma.
Hello,
Yes.
I'm sorry. We're just finishing up the tasting now, and I was like, oh, and Scott's joined me as well. But I'm bummed to be missing it, but it sounds like everything's amazing.
Everything's under control. Don't worry.
go back to work.
Yeah, so good opportunity to jump onto the next one. So last dram this evening is Auchentoshan. Now, Auchentoshan, as you might have guessed from my comment earlier, it's not a whiskey I'm particularly fond of. I think by and large, as a distillery, it's not very inspiring. Um, and I've said this multiple times over the years. It's just a distillery. I bear it no ill will, but I think just the triple distillation thing often makes it quite a thin, light malt whiskey without a huge amount of character, and so it often leans on wood to derive its character. So obviously not really, my style, but when we tasted this cask, I thought, well, this one's really, really good. So that's why this bottling exists. It's nothing more simple than just I was given a cask sample. We had an opportunity to do it. I loved it. So here it is as a bottling. Single cask strength, 31-year-old Auchentoshan, entirely matured in a second fill bourbon barrel. What I really like about this whiskey is that this is where I think with enough time and refill wood, even though, so obviously there is a fair bit of wood activity in this. You can tell from the color and from the, as you go along and taste it, it obviously has taken a bit of influence from the cask, but I think that's served it really well. I think the profile of this whiskey actually reminds me more of old Irish whiskey. You've got this kind of almost pure pot Irish style with this oiliness and this really nice, quite intense green and almost exotic fruitiness, and this slightly richer notes of like metal polish and honey. And it's so much going on in there that is really quite distinctive and quite different. And I think that on this occasion, it's triple distillation plus a lot of time in the right sort of cask. That's really the right combination for Auchentoshan in my view. So yeah, I was delighted with this cask, really happy with the whiskey, didn't feel the need to do anything with it except just bottle it as it came. And yeah, every distillery can surprise you on occasion and confound you. And this is the exception that proves the rule, in my view. So yeah, I'm curious to see what you all think. But yeah, I was really happy with this cask.
This is probably the punchiest ABV, even though we've had higher ABV whiskies tonight. There's some, I don't know, maybe it's the
Well,
glass I'm having.
the first one was yeah 57, and then everything has been below that until now. Um,
I got a bit of plastic from the cap. You're not meant to drink the plastic, mate. There's no plastic on the tasting notes, I believe.
Not official tasting notes. If you can include plastic in your own tasting notes if you want, just please don't publish them. Yeah, so to me, this and the label sort of illustrates this as well. I thought this was a whiskey very much about a really interesting fruit profile.
I've said this in previous tastings. Apologies if I'm rambling. I personally have two types of whiskeys. I like one I sip on, try and dissect, and others I just take a big swig and get that full mouthfeel experience. This feels one of those mouthfeel experiences. You get a burst of flavors, and it's delicious when you do that.
I don't think I've ever had chrysanthemum tea, which is what Sally is saying they're getting in the tasting. I'll need to add that to my tasting lexicon.
I get that, Sally. Especially when it's become a bit bitter when it's been sitting too long in the cup or boiling.
I think that these sorts of tea characteristics, I agree. I think this one also has this kind of like herbal tea or fruit tea character, which is in some respects it's like this can give this kind of floral impression, but also a tannin. And I think that those characteristics often come from older whiskies where they've spent many years in the cask, so they do have a tannin aspect from the whiskey. And in the same way that if you leave tea to stew for quite a long time, that slight bitter edge you're getting in it is from the tannin.
Might launch the poll just so people can start voting.
Yeah.
So please vote for your top two. Angus, as hosts, we can see the results before everyone else. So as Emma says, it's a bit of a horse race. But yeah, as we start wrapping up towards the end of the night, any questions for Angus? It doesn't have to be whiskey related. I'm sure he reserves the right to answer any question. He won't do your taxes
any
for you, but
I can't promise I'll give you an answer to every question, but
I've got one. So you mentioned it at the beginning. Those whiskies from Blair Castle, they sold for a penny at auction, and then some. But how they were from the 1800s or something crazy?
ported. So essentially, these bottles were found in an old cellar bin, which had a wooden plaque saying "small still whiskey, 1830 something," and then rebottled. I can't remember the exact dates. 1833, rebottled 1930 or 1928, something like that. So yeah, so I tried the whiskey on three different occasions. There later became this huge furore around. I don't know if it was huge, but there was a lot of pushback. People saying, "Oh, this is not. You can't guarantee the dates, and we can't." So I think that clouded a little bit the what for me was actually a really exciting discovery, which is, you know, and having looked at the glass and the bottles, and then looking at the records and the story, I feel like there was enough circumstantial evidence to at least say this is very, very old Scotch whiskey. And then to try it, uh, it was really impressive to taste. It was genuinely really good quality whiskey. It was pretty different. It was very old school, and it was, to go back to what I was saying before, really heavy, full body, textural, amazing mouthfeel. Not so much peat as I would have expected, and an absence of fruit, I would say, but really thick, oily, very waxy, and really of a style which I wouldn't say has been made in Scotland since the 50s. And really interesting that, assuming it was from the 19th century, and I have tried other whiskies from the 19th century, um, so it fits in line with those sorts of whiskies I have tried. Um, and it speaks to a style of whiskey production which is, really historic and pretty much lost. Uh, so to me, it was exciting and very fun. Um, but then I think it later on got kind of lost in this sort of online criticism of things like carbon dating and uh, chemical analysis and what you can claim at auction and what you can't. I don't know. So, but as the person that tasted it a few times, I can say it was fascinating, and it made me think a lot about, you know, what the personality of Scotch whiskey has been as a drink historically, and the kind of journey it's been on, and opened up a lot of questions in my mind about production practices going back that far into history, and the fact it was recognizable as a drink to me as Scotch whiskey was really quite striking. I wasn't sure what to expect when I tried it, and what I got was something really impressive and really interesting. So yeah, but who knows now? Those bottles have all been bought, and I'm sure that other people will open them, but how much, publicity that'll get, or whether they've all just gone into private collections, I don't know. Um,
I was chatting with a few of the other sort of collectors last time I was in Japan, and they said so much of the card series are just sitting on people's shelf, and they the same Joker, the silver one, the chromosome one, is just
yeah,
like sold on the same auction like every 4, 5, 10 years, and that I'm sure your auction house has seen the same bottle, like it just is on repeat, and then eventually just ends up here in someone's cellar door to never be looked at again. But yeah, some of those bottles that fetch crazy prices. The
yeah,
Japanese bartender said he used to buy Black Bowmore because it was popular and at a decent price, but he said now that the same bottles are coming back on auction over and over again, and he's like, there's no way to work out how they've been stored, let alone the crazy prices. And he's like, I just want to buy a good one to have open on the bar because that's I've always had one for the last 20 years, and you can't, yeah, you don't know how it's been stored is a challenge.
it's the same problem. I mean, all these really expensive things at auction now are getting into the realms of, they're not really. It's become less and less about the liquid. It's I mean the liquid underpins it, of course, but they've become kind of tradable artifacts, and it's not really. It's sitting in a weird space between kind of the world of fine art and the world of like realistic bottles where people might actually open them. And it's this sort of strange no man's land of incredibly overpriced trinkets. And yeah, I don't know what the end result of all these things is, because a lot of these things were not bottled to last that long. I mean, you can already see some of these decanters that things like Karazawa and Hanyu were filled into. They've got very basic corks and basic seals, and they already had big head spaces, and they're just going to evaporate, and then what? So it's become very silly, and I think that's why you start to see some of these prices cooling off a little bit to some extent. Um, I don't know. We live in a world of where whiskey has kind of jumped the shark a little bit sometimes and gone through the looking glass of ridiculousness. Um, I don't know. Thankfully, I think there's still lots of good drams around which are still a bit under the radar, and I think also there's a lot more new people coming online making whiskey in a much more interesting way, which means hopefully as drinkers there'll be a lot more really good new whiskies to enjoy in the future. Um, one of which hopefully will be our distillery Kythe. So I
I
will
was about
just
to say,
answer the question
yeah, a
quickly
perfect
on the
segue.
question. Yeah, we are still on track to commence production around start of next year. And if we do decide to bottle something, it'll only be when it's, I mean, when we decide to bottle something, it'll be if and when we're comfortable that it's ready. But we anticipate that what we would like to try and achieve, what we hope to do is bottle something for release probably in about year 6 when it's 5 years old. We might do a small release then. But, it really depends on the process and our comfort that we're hitting the sort of quality standards that we set for ourselves. So yeah, that's where we are. When we have more meaningful things to report and some more pictures of things happening on site in terms of the stills being installed and all this stuff, then it'll be up on our social channels and you can follow us. And I would still always recommend, if you want to know about what we're doing, is to sign up to our mailing list via our distillery website, so kythedistillery.com.
Throw the link up in a minute. Some of the Whisky List team will be visiting Scotland later this year, which I've sort of given Angus a heads up. But you just reminded me there's a distillery in Western New South Wales called Blackgate. They use a direct fire still, but their barley is Scottish barley. I don't want to know what the carbon footprint is on the journey it takes, but it is. They just make whiskey that they want to drink. It's very raw, unhinged. But I'll make sure the bottle or the samples arrive at your desk very soon. You have to try it because I'd just be curious to see how your new make or even a couple-year-old versus theirs just goes. They've got crazy climates, so minus 20 degrees Celsius in winter to 50 degrees Celsius in summer in the middle of the desert. So no, that's it. That's Blackgate.
Yeah, well, I'd love to try it. We're consciously trying to, appraise ourselves of, all these other producers doing anything interesting or similar to us, so we can understand what other people have been doing. I think it's obviously really important for us to do our research and be aware of what others have achieved or the kind of results other people are getting. It'll help us with our own decision making as we start to produce.
Shall we see the results?
Yeah, let's do it.
Gone. So the Nevis takes the win. The Old Orkney tied with a blend, followed by the Auchentoshan.
I'm a little bit surprised by those results, but also pretty pleased with them as well. That's cool, and it's nice to see quite a distribution of preferences across most of the drams. That's cool.
I think it's always going to be hard for when you got 19, 20-something-year-old, 46, 31-year-old whiskey, a 5-year-old's never going to stand up. So I'm glad we put that one first.
I'm not too worried about that. I mean, there's nothing there that surprises me except that I'm, quite amazed that Ben Nevis won out. I would have thought it might be the blend or the Auchentoshan, but it's really nice to see Ben Nevis and Old Orkney performing so well. That's really cool. Also, maybe an insight into the tastes of Australian drinkers. Maybe
please,
just like drinking engine oil and toolbox grease.
That's us. Send plenty more liquid, please.
All right, bear that in mind.
All right, I might
Well,
call it officially good night. Thank you all for joining. Massive thanks to Angus for his time. Angus, do you mind staying on for a couple more minutes just
yeah,
for a
yeah,
quick
no worries.
debrief? Otherwise, we'll see you at the next tasting. Cheers, everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Cheers, everyone. Nice to see you all. See you next time.